Hi Ingrid, welcome to the Illuminating Teams podcast. It's great to have you with me today.
Hi Dan, pleasure to be here.
Great. So I like to start these interviews just a little bit of personal and professional background. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your experience as an organizational psychologist?
Yeah, sure. So I would say probably my career in leadership started very early when I was about 17, 18, and I got to lead a non-for-profit in my local, a local not-for-profit in my hometown. And that was really my first experience leading a team, leading people, leading organization. And I quickly learned that people can really make or break the business. So I think that was kind of a catalyst for me to study organizational psychology and pursue this career in people and organizations. And I think ever since I've really been curious about, how do you enable people, leaders, and organizations to flourish and really realize their potential. And I've been working with leaders for the last 10 years across all levels. So from frontline team leaders, middle managers, executives across all different industries. So tech, healthcare, education, financial services, government, and probably some others as well.
Fantastic. And what is your role at the moment? Can you tell us a little bit about who you work for and what you're doing currently?
Yeah, so I'm a director at Nous, which is a about 600 people international management consultancy. So we do a lot of basically the whole suite of kind of business practices, but I focus mainly on helping business leaders and HR leaders in solving their organizational and people challenges. So what that means is, I would mostly work on topics like leadership, learning and development, capability, culture, talent management and performance management, organizational design, things like that.
You're covering a broad range of topics there. So you've had, that sounds like you've had a lot of experience, and I mean, across, I guess, different levels of the organization, from the top middle management to team leaders, or all sorts of leadership. I'm particularly interested to talk to you a bit more about that sort of team leader function. Can you tell us a little bit more about some insights you've had from working with people who are team leaders at that level of the organization?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, about team leaders, probably just to clarify what we mean by that for all our listeners. So it's really people who are leading individual contributors. So usually they would report to middle management or senior management, depending on the size of the organization, but they're kind of really that front line, right? And so some of the things that come to mind in terms of my work with them, probably one is around that the majority of them are promoted into their team leadership. Kind of this is their first experience as leaders. And usually they're promoted on their technical or subject matter expertise, which, they still very much excel at, but just because they have that skill set doesn't mean that they're automatically good leaders, because there's a different set of skills required for that. And then in my conversations with team leaders, I think they really like to describe themselves as being in a sandwich. And what that means is, that they're always kind of working through the tensions below that are in between the top and the bottom. So, their team members would have expectations, but then the top management also has expectations, and they're the ones that need to translate that and work with those tensions. And probably the third thing is about, that they need to wear different hats, right? So they still need to be subject matter experts, but they also need to be managers, and they also need to be leaders. And it's not easy to wear so many hats and so many roles. And especially when, there is a lot of work and there's a lot of stress, as humans, we tend to revert back to what we feel comfortable with, to kind of get into our comfort zone. And what that means for team leaders is that they would go into their, subject matter technical expert role more so than what the team members probably really need, which is them being leaders and being managers.
For sure. No, I can totally understand. As someone who's worked in big corporate before, I think I've seen, those levels. I think it is that team leader role is particularly difficult. You mentioned there sort of two roles, I guess they play, that as a team leader, you're sort of managing, but you're also leading. Interested to know how you sort of think about how you distinguish those two things, how you think about the difference between a manager and a leader. Can you share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, hopefully this is not a too controversial one, because, I think nowadays there's a bit of a premise that it's not good to be a manager, right? Because management is still associated with, this command and control and kind of management style. But I think that's more of an old school view of management, even though, some people still deploy it these days. But I think when I think about management is really about, in kind of managers are the ones that focus on the task and kind of making sure that the objectives are delivered and executed on, whereas leaders are those that are focusing on the people side. So managers, would be planning the work to deliver the objectives. They would be planning the resources, making sure that everything's delivered within time, budget, and scope. Whereas then leaders, on the other hand, would be really thinking about, how do I bring people along? How can I support them so that they do the work well? How can they enable them? How can I help them grow and make sure that they perform at their best? So I think these are kind of the two components that I think all team leaders need to have and kind of shuffle between. And then obviously, like, as you grow in your leadership role and you become more senior, you would expect to be less of a manager and more of a leader, right? And someone who's on the executive level probably shouldn't be managing at all, even though we still find that that's the case. But yeah, that's how I understand these two concepts.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think that is complicated for a team leader to be able to shift between those two things subtly without it being so distinct that now I'm in my manager role and therefore I'm going to hold you to task, and now I'm in my putting my leader hat on, and therefore I'm going to sort of act in a particular way. So I think it's definitely a skill in itself to be able to blend those two things in a coherent way when leading a team. I'm also interested to know what you think are some of the characteristics that make a good leader.
Well, as also as an organizational psychologist, I've seen a lot of leadership theories and models, and all of them tell you what a good leader is, or who good leader is, and what are the the behaviors and attitudes that they should have. And if I'm thinking about what are probably the key elements of all those theories, I think in my view there's probably 4 of them. So the first one would be, a really good leader needs to set clear direction and vision for where the organization or the team, in the case of team leaders, where their team is headed. And that means, explaining the why and the what, because if you tell both, then team members have enough context to actually make decisions autonomously and be able to drive the work towards, achieving that vision. And then another one is probably mostly connected with the theory of servant leadership, but I think it's really important in today's environment. It's, how do you serve your people? Servant leadership is about putting your people's needs first and not your own, and really, looking how can you enable them, meaning how can you remove any constraints and obstacles that they have in order to deliver the work. How can you help them grow? How can you, motivate them? And for example, a selfless and, a servant leader would, even for a person that is in their team and it's a, complete superstar, and they would still want to keep them on their team. They would be thinking, but what is it you want, and what would be good for the organization, to keep them motivated and engaged. So if that means moving them to another team, that's what a selfless and a servant leader would do. So if I'm thinking, the first thing is you set the direction, then you kind of help people perform at their best by serving them. The third thing, that is probably the most difficult one, is holding them accountable, right? And that means, providing them regular feedback on their performance, on their behaviors, right? Especially if they're aligned with the values and the culture of the organization. And this is why I say this is difficult, is because probably this involves quite a bit of, developmental feedback, which is always difficult to give. And then probably the fourth thing, which I might have even started with it, because the research shows that it's probably the most important characteristic of all. It's self-awareness. So what that means is, that people really know, and the leaders really know, what they're really good at and what they're not as good at. And then they have enough, humility to bring people onto their teams that can compensate for their weaknesses. And really the research in self-awareness shows that this is one of the best predictors of leadership success. And what that means in practice is really, people knowing their strengths, their weaknesses. They can objectively evaluate their performance, their behaviors, but then they can also understand how others see them.
I think that's really interesting. And when I think about those, and I think about leadership, I often think about like leaders in popular culture, and if they would have these characteristics or not, and if therefore we consider them good leaders. I think often in something like business school, like you would have been taught, like, Richard Branson is like a classic one, where like, he's a visionary, he's a great leader, and like, so where would he fit? Or like maybe Elon Musk or something, for a more modern day example, like would he have these characteristics? And I think about leaders and wanted to ask you what you think about this concept of people discuss whether leaders are born or if leaders can be taught, because I think often some of these famous leaders of businesses, often I think people think of them as being born leaders. Do you think that that leaders do tend to be born with some of these characteristics, or can you teach people some of these, a mix of these, what seemingly are soft skills as well, in combination with being a charismatic, visionary leader of people?
Yeah, it's a good question. And probably, again, if I put my organizational psychologist hat, I would look what the research says. But then also, from my own practice, I can add to it. So if we look at, the research in psychology, we know that every behavior is a byproduct of genetics, but also environmental influences. And if we look at leadership in particular, we can see that leadership is around 30 to 60% heritable. And that's mostly because of the main leadership traits that kind of predict leadership. Behaviors such as personality traits and intelligence are mostly heritable. But of course, with these numbers, it still means that environment has a big influence. And the research also shows that, for example, a really good coaching intervention can boost leadership capabilities 20 to 30%. So with that, kind of building on what you've said around, leaders being born, and I think those that, are visionary, as you said, or are great risk takers and great communicators, and they're able to bring people along, which we say are natural leaders. I think in the end, they're still not good at everything. Like leadership, it's such a, broad skill set. And I've worked with leaders who've been leading for 20 plus 5 years, and they still find novel situations where their leadership is tested. So they continue to build and learn as they go. So I think leadership is a lifelong journey, and leadership can definitely be learned, especially around, as you said, the soft skills. And if I'm thinking, for someone who wants to improve their leadership, whether that comes naturally to them or not, because as I said, I think there's always room for improvement, even if you're a natural born leader. I would say, it's really good to start with your strengths. So think about, what you're really good at and leverage that. So for example, if you're a really good listener, you can, as a leader, learn how to become more of a coach. So what is kind of the coaching questions that you can build to really be that servant and coaching type of leader. And then probably another thing is that has to do with that self-awareness, is like reflecting regularly on your leadership, reflecting on your impact, which can be very easy, right? Like you go into a meeting, you come out of the meeting and you just reflect, how did I do? How did I show up as a leader? Did I create the impact that I wanted to or not? And just getting into this practice of self-reflection can really help a lot, especially if it's married with, regularly talking to people that report to you, people that you report to, and kind of getting feedback from them around, what behaviors they really value and what they maybe would like to see less of. And I think, having that network around yourself, such as, your manager, maybe a mentor or a coach, and of course, then, podcasts or books and leadership trainings and all of those types of resources can really help leaders to, upskill themselves.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's lots of really good tips in there. Just pivoting back towards, I think, going from more general back to something slightly more specific, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the current challenges as you see them sort of today for team leaders. It's an interesting time, I think, for everyone at work. We've had the pandemic, and then we've got now seemingly some new challenges, macroeconomic challenges. I think both macro and more micro challenges. But I'm interested to hear sort of what you're seeing as the most important challenges at the moment for team leaders that they're facing as we are in September 2022.
Yeah, great. And I like that you framed it more as a macro challenge, because I wouldn't dare to speak about specific challenges that team leaders have, because it's obviously very contextual depending on where they are in their leadership journey and what's happening in their organizations. But if I look at the macro kind of trends in the world of work, right, as you said, pandemic, probably we're kind of over the pandemic at this stage, I would think, at least in Australia. But some of the ways of working that we picked up during the pandemic are still here and will remain for the time being. Let's see longer term. And I'm referring mostly to hybrid and remote work, where employers have realized that this is a big employee value proposition, and that employees really want that flexibility. So this is one challenge that team leaders need to navigate. And then probably the other one is, it started about maybe 9 months ago, or maybe even a year now, is this great reshuffle that people talk about, right? Or great resignation. And it seems like it's not slowing down, it's still there. And what that means for leaders, it also creates a lot of challenges, also, especially in Australia, difficulty to recruit skilled people. But yeah, if I look at the kind of the hybrid work, what are the main challenges that I see there? The first one is probably around, how do you lead people and teams that are dispersed, especially if they are, working across different time zones. And that's been something that people have been navigating over the last 2 years. But I think then the other one, probably even more important, that's gonna show up now that we've been working for so long in this environment, is this challenge of building a strong team cohesion and engagement, and the sense of belonging in a team, and making team and work really meaningful as opposed to something that is just transactional. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was super excited and, quite happy to move into the flexible work arrangements. But now that I've been talking to leaders and organizations, it seems like it's showing up, this challenge of engagement and team cohesion. And on the great reshuffle, what's probably challenging apart from the recruitment perspective is that the changes in the team composition can really affect the team dynamics, or if there's a lot of people leaving, it can affect the team morale and team cohesion. And then there's also increased workload for those people that are still staying in their positions, right? And if this is not managed well, it can really deteriorate in terms of team dynamics, team's morale, and even the well-being of team members, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other one is, if you have already so much workload and if you're potentially working remotely in a hybrid environment, how do you effectively onboard people and how do you give them enough support in those first few months that are so critical for their success, right? Also knowing that once they come on board, they're not going to be instantly productive. So it's going to take a little bit of time. So that pressure that's been put on the team for so many months, trying to fill that void, it's still not going to go away immediately when someone new joins.
Yeah, no, they're really good points. And I think I can certainly relate. Here at Lumi, for us, I'm now talking to you actually from Stockholm in Sweden, but we are ourselves, a distributed organization across the US, Australia, Europe, and Asia. And I think that time zone challenges are definitely a big part of one of the big challenges for us internally. I know also for many of our customers. And certainly, I think, the interesting around what I think was the Great Resignation has definitely turned more into the Great Reshuffle. I think, again, as the macroeconomic climate sort of has deteriorated and we've moved from, I don't know, there still seems to be a lot of passing with employees in terms of the job market is still pretty tight, but the fact that we've seen more layoffs especially in technology companies has maybe shifted slightly the power dynamic. Although in saying that, we're seeing this quiet quitting trend at the moment as well. Do you have any practical tips then for team leaders, particularly on let's take the second point on the Great Reshuffle, and anything that team leaders can do around those challenges like onboarding, team morale, things like that? Yeah.
And just to kind of on your point when you were talking about the Great Reshuffle, I think we like to see it as, doom and gloom in what now leaders and organizations need to manage. But I think there's also a lot of opportunity in that, and if organizations, but also then team leaders look at it from that perspective, they can see that, they can get some, really fresh thinking in the organization, a lot more motivation, right? Because when you start and when you're a newcomer, you bring a lot of kind of energy into the team, and, which is kind of the opposite of quiet quitting that you were just talking about. So in order, I think, for team leaders to, help manage that situation, some of the things that I can think of, for example, with the morale perspective would be, to dial up their servant leadership that we talked about before. So really make sure that they are, empathetic and there for their people. So checking in with them regularly, seeing how they're feeling, helping them, make sense of things, reassure them, so that that they feel like they still have the backing. Then probably on the workload perspective, you could think about, if you feel that the team is really getting stressed out with the amount of work that's on their plates, like what can you prioritize or deprioritize, and then really have the conversation with your manager about that, and push back on the work that's coming down the line. On the onboarding side, I think some of the things that I've seen work really well is getting newcomers butted up with existing team members. this gives a bit of, responsibility to the team member, but also offload some of that responsibility of the leader to provide all the answers. It's really good if, the body is somewhat, on the same level, so that they can, support each other, but also kind of build more of the team cohesion, and the new person gets integrated into the team more easily this way. And if, if the composition in the team is quite big, or there's been a lot of changes in the team, what I would recommend team leaders to do is maybe develop a team charter with their team. It's just like a one-page document to really outline, and align the team around, what's our purpose, what is everyone's role and responsibilities, what do we expect from each other in terms of collaboration, behaviors, communication. So just to really kind of get a common understanding across everyone in the team.
Yeah, fantastic. They're really good practical tips. Thanks for sharing those. So I think I just wanted to wrap up with a final question that I like to ask everyone who comes on, and I'm sure you in your position with your experience could probably draw on all sorts of different resources, but I'd like to ask if there's one resource you would recommend. I guess in this case it would be good recommending in terms of leadership, perhaps for the team leader. It can be a podcast, a book, a research paper, anything you think might be particularly helpful, or that's helped you in your getting to where you are today.
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of resources that I can think of. So like at the moment, for example, I'm reading Good to Great from Jim Collins, and The Hard Thing About the Hard Things, I don't know, from Ben Horowitz. Maybe you've come across those great books, but maybe more for senior leaders. Although I think, team leaders can also get some inspirations there, and kind of distill some of those principles for their teams. But otherwise, anything from researchers and authors like Simon Sinek or Brené Brown, Patrick Lencioni, Adam Grant. These are all like great people who write and talk about leadership a lot. So definitely recommend looking them up. And in terms of the kind of one thing that I could leave your listeners with, one of the models that I really like and I use very often with leaders, because I think it's a very simple model but very powerful, is this concept of a leadership shadow. I don't know, have you come across this before?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so it's I think it was developed by Goldman Sachs initially, but then iterated through years. Kind of the idea is that every leader has a shadow that they cast. And that shadow is basically, an impact that they create in the organization with what they say, do, prioritize, and recognize. And the more senior the leader, the bigger that shadow is. And employees are obviously looking up to leaders, and they see that shadow, and they especially pay, close attention to how congruent it is. Meaning, if a leader they say, it's really important to maintain our work-life balance and well-being, but then they constantly send emails late at night and on the weekends without any explanation. What do you think? Mm-hmm. Like, employees will probably believe what the leader does, not what they say, right? And I think as leaders, it's really easy to say things. It's a lot more difficult to do them. So I would definitely encourage everyone to look into this model and maybe, reflect on their leadership shadow, get some feedback from other people on how congruent it is, and then think about how they want to improve it.
That's fantastic. Thanks. I think, I haven't heard of that leadership shadow. I'm going to look up more about it after this. I think that's a really nice concept. It makes a lot of sense. Great. Well, thank you so much, Ingrid, for coming on and chatting with me today. You've shared so many interesting insights, I think, on leadership and current work trends and challenges, and also, you know, lots of practical tips for team leaders. So really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Yeah, pleasure then.
Thank you.